Hi, everybody. Welcome. Can I first just can everybody see the screen okay? You can give a thumbs up or a reaction. Excellent. Wonderful. Well, welcome. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. You can share what brings you to today's session. As Kendra said, my name is Maxine Alloway, and I started off as an elementary school teacher and taught elementary school for about 10 years. And I have been at the University of Washington since 2006. Most of my work is in teacher education, so supporting new teachers, but also work with practicing teachers, as Kendra said. And as part of all of this, and as things kind of evolve in higher ed, I ended up taking a lot of what I was doing with working with teachers and kind of broadened it to think about how do adults learn in general, which is really exciting because we often don't kind of connect the body of research known as adult learning to our work in professional development. And so for the past few years, I've been really trying to connect those two bodies of research. So thank you for being here. As Kendra said, please do use the chat or interrupt at any time if you've got any questions. I'm hoping this will be fairly interactive. I know that Zoom, some people kind of like to come to Zoom and just have it in the background while they cook dinner, but it's often nice to feel like it's really teaching. And so the more interactive, the better. So please do use the chat or interrupt at any time. So thank you, Pete. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Sabrina and Haley. And with that, we will get started. So again, right, schools as places where adults learn, we'll talk about theories of adult learning to support teacher learning. I really do have kind of three main objectives, if you will. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about Malcolm Knowles's principles of andragogy, which is also just a fun word, andragogy, as well as Stephen Billett's theory of workplace learning. These are only two of many theories of adult learning and workplace learning that are out there. And I feel like they're pretty easy to connect between these theories and what we do in schools, which is why I've chosen those two. You'll have a chance to reflect on how these principles connect to your work, both past and present, and use these theories to help envision any kind of learning opportunities that might be coming up for yourself or for teachers that you work with. So I always like to kind of, that's our plan, right? We'll do a little activating prior knowledge. We'll talk about andragogy. We'll talk about workplace learning before we close up in just our hour that we have together. I always like to start any teaching by just checking and seeing if anyone has any burning questions. Anything that you feel like, if I don't ask this now, I'm not going to focus. So I'll pause to see if anyone has burning questions. All right. Well, if questions come up as we go, please do write them in the chat or, again, interrupt anytime. Let's do first just a little activity to kind of get you thinking about your own experiences. So I'm going to ask you to think about a time when you learned something through a professional development opportunity. What did you learn? What happened in that session? Why do you think that was an effective learning for you? I know for me, I often think about some of the coaching work that I got to do when I was a classroom teacher. And it really was effective because it was so personal and it was so much about what I wanted to work on. And then also think about a time when you did not learn through a professional development opportunity. What happened in that session? Why do you think it was not an effective learning for you? Again, I don't know that I would have said at the time I didn't learn, but I know that I went to kind of this big workshop seminar that Lucy Calkins had years and years ago. And I can't tell you a thing that I learned out of it, other than it was Lucy. And so, that's an example of a time that it wasn't particularly effective. And I think it was probably because it was a large group and it was a lot of being talked at. I want to give you a chance to think about this, and you have kind of three options for how you want to participate. You might just want to think for yourself about it, and that's totally fine. You might write, you might not. That's one option. A second option is that we will open a few breakout rooms. So you're welcome to go to a breakout room and get a chance to talk with other people about these experiences, these ideas. If you do that, you can quickly introduce yourself and then share your stories. And you're also welcome to use the chat as a way to hold yourself accountable to doing the thinking, but not talk to others. So totally up to you. I'm going to set a timer for 4 minutes. Kendra's going to open some breakout rooms and we'll come back together in 4 minutes. Welcome back. Hopefully you got a chance to kind of think for yourself and maybe got a chance to talk to others. Reading through the chat, you'll see lots of themes, lots of things that will resonate with you, I suspect, as we talk particularly about andragogy. So with that, I want to share a little bit about the theory of andragogy. Which again, you may or may not be familiar with, but andragogy is really the art and science of teaching adults. So it's related to pedagogy, right? Ped being related to children, but the andragogy is focused on adults and adult learning. I'm teaching a class right now, and I was listening to a reflection of a student, and she kept calling it androgyny. It's not androgyny, not related, but rather andragogy and the art and science of teaching adults. The biggest name in andragogy is Malcolm Knowles. There's a little photo of him. But a lot of folks today are really taking his ideas and kind of putting it in a modern context, putting it in a multicultural context. There's some really nice books that have just been published recently. We're going to go over his 6 core principles, which again, you'll see really resonate with a lot of what you were saying as you were thinking about your own experiences. And we'll be sending the slides out after today's session. And on this slide, you'll see there are several resources. So there's an article that's explicitly looking at equity-focused, anti-racist professional development for teachers using the 6 principles. It's a great article. There's also a 4-minute video just describing andragogy, as well as kind of a connection to a book, which really does a nice job of explaining Knowles's ideas. So, oops, that is, oh no, 1 second, I'm so sorry. I clicked on the link by accident. 1 moment. Let me get this back to slideshow. There we go. All right. So we've got those links. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about these key principles. And so if you've got questions, you can write them in the chat. The first principle that Knowles talks about is the learner's need to know. This is really the concept that learners need to know what they're learning, why they're learning it, how they're going to learn it, right? It's why in the beginning of lots of sessions, we'll go over what the objectives are. People will share kind of, here's the agenda for the day. Oftentimes, the more control that teachers or adults have on their learning, right? So that, why am I learning it? Oh, I got to choose what I'm learning. When we have, multiple sessions at a conference, that's connecting to the learner's need to know because you're choosing where you want to go. That's the first principle. The second is the principle of self-directed learning. This is the idea that most adults want to, again, have control, want to direct their own learning. I'll often say to my undergrads, like, the idea of because I told you to or because I said so doesn't work so well with kids, and it really doesn't work with adults, right? Adults need to have that sense of, I'm choosing this. Self-directed learning doesn't mean I do it all by myself. an adult signs up for, you all engaged in self-directed learning by signing up for today's session, right? Hopefully no one told you you had to come, right? You chose to come. That's being a self-directed learner, even if you're learning from someone else. The third principle, I think pretty common to us as educators, because it works for kids as well. Prior experiences of the learner. We know the importance of activating prior knowledge, even more so for adults who have even more lived experiences than the children we work with. And so really important for adult learners to connect to prior experiences. Readiness to learn is this idea that we can't learn anything just, anything anytime, right? Both when you think about during the pandemic, there was not a lot of teacher learning going on beyond the technology because there was just no one was really ready to learn. And you might also have had some of your teachers all of a sudden started using technology that they hadn't prior, because now they needed to learn, right? That readiness to learn factor was there. And that can often be really helpful when we think about new teachers, right? New teachers often struggle with classroom management because they haven't really needed to learn that yet. And so they'll learn it when they're ready to learn it, when it's their own classroom and not their mentor teacher's classroom, for example. So I think this idea of readiness to learn can often kind of help others understand why they're struggling with what they're struggling with. The fifth one, I feel like I saw a lot of in the chat, this idea of orientation to learning and problem solving. Knowles talks about how adults in general are less likely to learn just for the sake of learning, right? Certainly there's some intellectual stimulation we learn for intellectual development, but most of the learning that adults do is to solve a problem, and has a real kind of applicable purpose to it. And that was one of the things that Knowles kind of pointed out. And the final one is motivation to learn. We know the importance of motivation for anyone. Adults tend to be more intrinsically motivated. Certainly, adult pay raises still help. But in general, adults want to learn for a sense of satisfaction, for a sense of feeling that self-efficacy of I've done something well. I'll pause to just see if there's any questions or comments. Again, I feel like these very much align to what you naturally were thinking about in terms of what makes good PD. While I love Knowles's principles, I can't remember them. And I teach this every quarter. And so I've created kind of my own mnemonic, if you will, that's easier to keep in mind for me. So hopefully, perhaps it will be for you as well. And that's the ABCs of adult learning. So taking Knowles's idea and just massaging it into an easy way to remember, right? It has to be applicable, because there has to be this intrinsic motivation in education. There's lots of research on kind of top down versus bottom up, who's creating the PD. That's all connected. It's not really about, did the principal say I had to, but it's really about where is the motivation coming from. So applicable, because control, the more we can have our teachers deciding what they're learning, how they're learning, when they're learning, all of that, the more adults have control, the better. And that this S in ABCs for C, right? This idea that we really have to see the learner. We have to draw on and build on our adults' experiences. I suspect that many of this feels intuitive, but sometimes having language for something helps us. It helps us if we're trying to write a grant. It helps us if we're trying to help me to explain why we're going to do what we're going to do. So hopefully these principles, this ABCs, is helpful in thinking about how are you designing what you're designing. So I want to give us another kind of interactive moment. To think back to those two experiences that you wrote about or talked about, and how do Knowles's principles help you think about what happened in each of those scenarios? Right in the chat, we can see there were lots that were really effective because it was problem solving. It was really focused on orientation and problem solving. Um, we can see the importance of relevance in the examples in the chat. So I want to give you a couple minutes to talk again, to write or go back to your breakout room or to think for yourself about these experiences. And you can also start doing a little forward thinking, if that's helpful as well, of how do you use these principles in any planning that you're doing for professional development. So, great. Excellent. Keep the conversation going. I've been trying to read through what everyone has said, but please do keep the conversation going. I'm going to add one more layer to how we think about this, and so that we have kind of more knowledge from outside of education to help us think about the work we do in education. And that's workplace learning. So just a little bit about workplace learning. So workplace learning across industries, employees engage in initial training or orientation and then continued learning. And we often forget that schools are not just places where children learn, but they're also places where adults work. And so to think about schools as workplaces and professional development as workplace learning might be another place where we can kind of look to see how do we support our teachers the best. So, most of these are pretty intuitive, but, across industries, when people think about workplace learning, there are legal requirements. In Washington State, we have clock hours. So sometimes people do professional development because they need the clock hours. If you get a new job or new role, there's obviously learning that has to happen with that. If you want to be promoted, that doesn't happen as much in education and in our schools, but certainly across industries. And it's something people have thought about over time around career ladders and things like that. Technological advances, right? As technology changes, we have to learn the technology. Personal satisfaction, how do you feel like you're getting better at your job? I was just talking with a teacher this morning who's working in a school where the population has changed a lot. She's been teaching at the school for 20 something years. And we were talking about the change in population in Issaquah. And and she really expressed this personal satisfaction as she was learning to work with different populations as her school changed and new apartment buildings were built and et cetera. And certainly, if you take a sociocultural perspective to learning, it just happens. Learning is going to happen. So, how do we think about making it kind of the most fruitful? Oftentimes, people will conceptualize workplace learning in kind of four categories: foundational learning, which is what you do kind of at college in kind of formal settings; external job training. This would be an example of that, right? Where someone goes outside of their workplace to get training at a conference, at a seminar, a webinar. Employer-based trainings, those are kind of the in-house PD that you do. And then the informal workplace learning. My dissertation was on teacher collaboration and the learning that happened through teachers collaborating. We see all of these in schools for sure, and there's been some research on kind of the different types of learning. But what I found really interesting is a man named Stephen Billett, who is a professor in Australia, kind of says, well, those four ways to conceptualize workplace learning, that might not be the best way to really think about how do we support learning. Maybe it's not about, oh, what percentage is external and what percentage is internal, and let's like focus on these categories. But instead, Billett says, what if we think about workplaces as learning environments and focus on three elements? The first is the practices, right? What are the things that we want, in our case, what are the things we want our teachers to be doing? What are the practices that we're trying to learn about? Participation is really, it's really about culture. I use kind of 3 Ps to help us remember, but it's how do people participate? This is very back in the 1980s. Susan Rosencrantz was writing about learning enriched schools and learning impoverished schools. And that's really what Billet is talking about across industries. That if you have a place, a culture where teachers are wanting to engage in learning together, there's a culture of collaboration. This is where the professional learning community research came from, right? The ways in which people in a workplace participate affects the kinds of learning that happens. We saw some of that as you were sharing some of your experiences. And then finally, the people. And Billet talks about the epistemological backgrounds of people. But who are the individual teachers? What are their backgrounds? What are their experiences? If I've got a staff where there's a lot of people who did not do well in traditional schooling, chances are a big national conference is not going to be a way for that group of people to learn, right? So, who are the individual people? What are their experiences with learning? Because that's going to influence this puzzle of professional development. So, if I'm trying to design professional development, and I really want my teachers to really start taking on more phonics instruction, right, as the practices. Well, I need to think about how do people participate in learning at my school? What engages people in learning? What are they participating in? And who are the individuals, right? Because it's always a collective is always a combination of individuals. And so thinking through these pieces can really help us think about work that we're designing. Again, as we're thinking about, okay, if I've got this thing I want people to learn, or maybe I've got a group of people, I really want my teachers to do more learning, so I can think about the practices and I can think about what's the participation, how do they engage with one another within the school and work context. So again, Billet says learning's going to happen in a workplace. We know learning will happen, but the more we can align our practices, our participation, and our people, the higher the quality of learning will happen. So I want to once again give you a chance to think about this and kind of chew on these ideas by thinking about an upcoming learning opportunity that maybe you're going to be engaging in and you want to think about how do you get the most out of it, or maybe you're designing it for a group of people, a staff, or etc. And so what are the practices that you want to focus on? What's the environment that this is happening within, and how do you use that to support the learning? And who's going to be participating? What do you know about the backgrounds of the people participating in whatever this learning opportunity is? We'll do our same thing with breakout rooms, where we can write in the chat, or you can join a breakout room to discuss, or you can just think for yourself a little bit. You're also welcome to think about, does this framework help you understand the experiences that you thought about in the beginning, right? Does it help you understand why something was so successful or not successful? So up to you if you think kind of future or past, whatever feels best to really just chew on these ideas of workplace learning and professional development. So we'll go ahead again, open breakout rooms, and we'll do this for a little bit longer. So if you want to chat this time, even if you haven't been going to breakout rooms, you're welcome to, because we'll do this for, we've got time. So maybe we'll do this for 10 minutes and I'll come around to the breakout rooms. So go ahead and do some thinking or sharing. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully in your breakout rooms, you had good conversations. We've had a little bit in the chat. We're gonna wrap up. So especially I know it's almost 5:30. There are some folks on the East Coast, so it's late for you. Thank you so much for joining us. But to close up, let's kind of do a little bit of sharing of how do you see yourself using the principles of andragogy and the research on workplace learning to support the professional development that you engage in? And I'll ask folks to either write in the chat or unmute yourself and share verbally, whichever you'd like. But it'd be great to hear from a variety of folks. How do you see using these ideas from kind of outside of the world of education in the work that you do with teachers? Maybe one more person. We've got some things in the chat as well. Anyone else want to verbally share? Yeah, Keith, thank you.
Yeah, I think what Michelle just said too, I think it's good reminders on active participation strategies with adult learners who are going to sit in the space, but they're much less willing typically to do what you ask them to do than a 7-year-old is, who is just going to do what you say because you're the boss and they say so and you're the adult. So remember, like, those active engagement strategies are really important with adults. I know that's something myself and my associate principal have been talking about pretty often lately, actually, is just remembering less of us talking and more of them doing whatever it is we're talking about. I think just the other thing that I think is going through my head, so I do right around this time every year in February, I always do a, hey, what do you guys want to focus PD on the rest of the year? Here's what we've done. Here's our topics. And then I use that to kind of guide our learning the rest of the year, because then I can also tell them, here was your voice. Like, here's what we're going to focus and prioritize. But also just, it's that reminder that our priorities aren't always their priorities with learning, and how do we, what's the correct juxtaposition, because as building leaders, we have certain things we're required to do, and we know that it may not always be. So it's like, how do we align, but also how can we get as much of that voice in there as possible, knowing that what we want them to be learning isn't always what they want to be spending their time doing in those moments.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe those are the times where you have to find other ways to bring in that choice that learners need to know. I'm going to set the content, but maybe there's choice around when or how, or yeah, thank you. I want to give space if anyone else wants to share. All right. Wait time on Zoom is still, Michelle, I don't know if you figured it out. Wait time is always hard online. Oops. Oh my goodness. I clicked on a link again. The reason not to do links, apparently. Well, just to wrap us up, my little plug for Connect Ed. This session is part of a broader series. If you're interested in lots of different types of professional development, and Kendra's going to talk about it more in a moment. But I would say that in my experience, all of the work that we do in Connect Ed really does try to build on these ideas. A lot of very applicable work, a lot of problem solving. And so do check out our website when we send you the link at the end, and be in touch with any questions or any feedback. As we were going through this, I was like, oh, this is actually there's not a lot of overlap between these two fields. And so thank you all for kind of playing in this combining of sandboxes with me today. You have my email. Please do be in touch. And I'm going to hand it over to Kendra to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Maxine. I feel like I got to think about a whole new terrain, right? This idea of workplace learning felt very novel to me, and kind of laying those two sets of ideas on top of one another and thinking about past experiences and what's coming up tomorrow and the next day was super helpful. So thank you for inviting us to think about those with you, joining your sandbox. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Oh, thank you. Yes, so I'll tell you a little bit more about the other webinars that are coming up in this series. So next month, Sylvia Bagley, who is the director of our instructional leadership program, she is going to be having a little conversation with some teacher leaders, thinking about what it means to really prioritize self-care and how that can allow us to support our students. So join us next month for that conversation. And then in April, Max Silverman, who's the executive director at the Center for Educational Leadership, is bringing together a panel of district leaders to really think about what it means for teachers and principals and families to collaborate to create schools where kids and all of those other people feel happy and proud of the work that they're doing. In May, we're going to have a conversation with the Edu Design folks. So Deborah Masacci and Gwen Sweeney lead our Edu Design Fellowship, and they'll introduce us to a model for teacher leaders kind of designing and leading their own professional learning and think together about what that could look like in your own setting. So we hope you can join us for any of those. I will drop a couple of links here in the chat. So you can find the full lineup of webinars at this site here. And a great way to find out or keep in touch with us, things that are coming up with Connected, is to join our mailing list if you're not already receiving our mailing list. So there's a link there. One more note, you are welcome to get clock hours for your participation in today's session if you are interested. There's a $15 administrative fee, and I will drop the link for that in the chat also. We really hope you keep coming back to these webinars. So as part of that email, you'll also get a discount code to get free clock hours for the remaining webinars. So if you want to come to all 4 and just pay once, please do. So you can access the information about how to get those clock hours at that link. And if you ever have any questions, you can always email Maxine or I as well. Let's see. Got one more slide. So if these ideas do sound interesting to you, you're looking to learn more, our office does do customized professional learning experiences. We can help you think through co-design, co-plan, co-lead learning experiences with your school, team, or district. So if that sounds interesting to you, please do be in touch. We'd love to brainstorm and come up with something beautiful and that helps meet some of these needs, right? The need for choice, the need for seeing applicability, right? We can work on those together. So with that, we will go ahead and wrap up. We appreciate you all taking time to spend your evening or afternoon with us. And we hope that you will stay in touch. Here's our email and our website. And with that, I'll let you go enjoy your evenings. Thank you, Maxine, and thank you everyone else.
Thank you so much, everyone.